Okay, this is Business 342, the practice final set number 1, problem number 5. You are considering two mutually exclusive projects. Mutually exclusive means you can't do them both. You can do one or the other, and that's it. Project A costs 3.6 million, has a required return of 14.5% and an IRR, internal rate of return, of 14.3%. Project B costs 4.1 million, has a required return of 16% and an IRR of 15.6%. Which project should be accepted? Okay, so remember, there's a little bit of a relationship between IRR and net present value. Net present value is when the present value of all the future cash flows, you get all the present values, all the future cash flows, you subtract the initial investment, and if it's positive, it means that your net present value is 0 or above. It means that it's an acceptable project, because it means for a required rate of return, which is what you use to discount those future cash flows, means for that required rate of return, you're going to have at least a positive number, which means you're going to at least meet that required rate of return. Okay, which means it's 0 or above as far as the net present value. If your net present value is below 0, it means that you didn't meet that required return and it's not an acceptable project. Okay, the difference between that and the IRR is the IRR, and they're kind of related, they're kind of not. The internal rate of return is the discount rate at which the net present value is 0. Okay, it means you use that if you use that discount rate to discount all the future cash flows and you subtract the initial investment, you'll come out at 0, dead 0. Okay, so if the net present value required rate of return is 14.5%, okay, which means at that rate you should at least have a net present value of 0 or above, and the IRR is telling you that your net present value is 0 at 14.3. Remember, a higher rate discounts those present values of the present value of the future cash flows more, so it makes them worth less. Okay, so if your required return on your net present value is 14.5 and your IRR, if your required return is 14.5, which means your net present value equals 0, and your IRR is 14.3, which means your net present value is 0 at 14.3, then you don't want to accept that project. It needs to be at least 14.5, which means that the net present value is 0 at 14.5, which is your required return. So this is at this rate of 14.3, your net present value would actually be below 0. Okay, project B is similar. It doesn't matter about what the costs are. Don't even be concerned about that. Okay, project B costs 4.1 million, has a required return of 16%. Remember, the required return is the point at which your net present value will equal 0. The IRR is 15.6%, which means that your net present value zeroes out at 15.6%. If the required return was higher, like 16%, your net present value would go negative. That's the same as the project A. So in both cases, the IRR is below the required return. So when the IRR is below the required returns, that means that the net present value is going to be negative, because it zeroes out at this rate, and if you had a higher rate, it's going to discount those future cash flows more, which means the net present value would be negative. So it says, would you choose project A, project B, both A and B, or neither A and B? In this case, just because the IRR is below the required rate of return, which means your net present value would be negative, because you'd be discounting. If you used your required return, it would discount those future cash flows to be worth less. You already know at these IRRs, the net present value, remember, the IRR is where the net present value is 0. A higher rate discounts those future cash flows more, which makes them worth less. So when you subtract the initial investment, you get a negative number in that case, which you don't want. Now, if both of these were above, if the IRRs were both above the required return, then you'd have a net present value of greater than 0. If they're both right at the required returns, you know your net present value would be 0, and that'd still be acceptable. You know, if its net present value is 0, it means at least you're meeting your required return. Okay, and so that's still acceptable. Remember that an IRR that meets your required return means your net present value is 0, which means that you're meeting your required return, which the minimum is where it makes the net present value 0, which is fine. Okay, so in this case, the answer is D. You would accept neither project. I'll put a D here. Okay, so that's practice final. Some of these I know I'm writing the answers on the side and circling, and some of them I'm not, but I've got the answers on the pages and I'm telling you them. So that is practice final for Business 342, Set 1, problem number 5.